Hello, Lucky Sevens. How you doing? Today we're going to continue to explore the big policy differences between Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson and their impact on the George Washington administration. Today we're going to look at foreign policy and French Revolution. And of course, you can imagine Hamilton and Jefferson have very different points of view on what we should do between Britain and France. So, if we're going to talk about this, we have to talk a little bit about the history of the French Revolution. Now, oh my gee willikers, we could do full courses on the French. I'm going to give you the very short abridged version. So, the French, as you might remember, were fantastic allies to the Americans during the war. If it wasn't for the French, if it wasn't for this guy, King Louis the 16th, committing the French army and French navy to the American Revolution and the cause for independence, most likely we are not the United States of America. And people like George Washington and Benjamin Franklin would have been caught, tried as traitors, and executed. So we owed the French quite a bit. But for all the love of overthrowing the rule of a king in America, the people that helped us do it weren't doing it because they didn't like kings. They were ruled by a king. They did it because they wanted to hurt their enemy, the British. And once our revolution was over and we had our independence, over in France, people who were French who fought in helping us win our independence started thinking, we're ruled by a king too, and our king also is kind of messed up. You see here, Louis the 16th, it looks pretty decked out. He's got gold all over the place. He lived a very opulent lifestyle. He lived in Versailles, which is one of the most beautiful palaces in the world. Literally gold and glass everywhere. And eat these massive feasts every single meal, every single day. And him and French nobility really just live like they are rock stars. Then you have the middle class, which is a small, really educated group called the bourgeois. And they feel shut out of this rigid class system. And they're really inspired by ideas of the Enlightenment, of ideas like John Locke, who we talked about, but also French Enlightenment thinkers like Robespierre. I will get to Robespierre later. Like Voltaire, mixed up my French names, like Voltaire and Montesquieu, among others. And the French Enlightenment thinkers definitely, just like the John Locke, were in favor of having a more fair system of government where the people's rights are protected, having civil liberties, natural rights, all those things. So you have this educated group of people who have some wealth but are pretty much shut out from advancing because King Louis and anybody who was born into the right family are living really these decadent lives. Then you have the proletariat, who is pretty much everybody else. People who are working as peasants, people who are working in factories, the working class of France that make up most of the population. And if you were one of them, you were living in terrible conditions. Starving to death in many instances, wrought with disease. So here you have, in the same area, people that are living in starvation conditions right next to people that are eating so much that they are busting from the seams. Louis the 16th, not a small man. This is coming from somebody who's not a small man. So when the revolution breaks out in 1789, it begins with this key event, the storming of the Bastille. Bastille Day is a holiday in France, kind of equivalent of our 4th of July. It's kind of the birth of the French Republic, the end of the French monarchy. And mobs of people. You see here, you see the Women's March of members of the proletariat, the working class, marching on Versailles. And the king and the queen, Marie Antoinette, are like, yo, we got to get the heck out of here. This isn't good. And they try to flee into Prussia, but they stumble and bumble along the way and they get caught. So now the king and the queen are now in the custody of initially these people from the bourgeois who think they have these great ideas of how we can have this fair ruling, and the common everyday people who have been starved and abused for years, who now have their hands on the people who they think have been abusing them. And things don't go great. The French Revolution falls into a period known as the Reign of Terror. It gets progressively more and more and more violent. The King Louis XVI and the Queen Marie Antoinette are both beheaded publicly by guillotine. Thump! Off with their heads. Here you see them holding King Louis's head out to the crowd. Again, this is a big deal. This is a big deal. Not only is it a government being overthrown, but the king is being killed publicly by his people. Remember, in European kingdoms, they believe that the kings were picked by God to rule. So you're going against all rules of convention by doing this to somebody who was royalty. This is truly revolutionary. Once again, while you could definitely debate whether or not our American Revolution really wasn't a revolution. King George's head never ends up on a stick. King Louis does. And at first, the members of the proletariat worked to put forward a republic that's built on the ideas of the Enlightenment, but mob rule takes over more and more and more. And you have a number of people who basically get the mob to turn on a person one day, and then the next day people turn on the person who got them to turn on that person. And we see thousands of people are ultimately in a 1 year span executed publicly in France as enemies of the state. And the real ringleader for this is this guy, Maximilien Robespierre, who has one of the oddest hairlines in history. I'm just saying. And for all of his joy, he ends up also first getting shot in the face, and that, if that was enough, he also gets the guillotine. So things are just in absolute pandemonium and chaos, but all in the idea of establishing a republic and giving the people the right to rule. So what do we do? If you're in Europe, you are terrified. If you're the kings of Prussia, of Britain, of Spain, if you're the Pope in Italy, and you see this happening and this overthrowing of all of the systems of order that have been in place for hundreds and hundreds of years, you're terrified. You don't want these revolutions spreading into your country. You don't want your leaders' heads ending up on sticks next. You want to keep that system of order. So we see that the other powers of Europe really work to try to rein in this reign of terror and stop it from spreading. Just to kind of expand a little bit, even though this is after the history of Washington, after the chaos of the Reign of Terror, people are anxious for law and order, and they turn to a dictator, a successful French general who had been fighting the British as they were trying to stop the spread of the revolt, by the name of Napoleon Bonaparte. Ends up being kind of the last man standing out of all the chaos of the Reign of Terror, and he seizes control of the government. He not only declares himself dictator, but he declares himself emperor, not just of France, but of Europe. And he sees his goal now to spread the ideals of the revolution throughout Europe. And he sets about conquering. And he gets really good at it. Taking over Spain, taking over parts of pretty much all of Italy, parts of present-day Germany, and starts pushing his empire. Here you see him dressed as an emperor, gold leafed crown like a Caesar, like a Roman emperor. And if you look here, you can see he even had the Pope forced the Pope to coronate him, to crown him as emperor, and then has the audacity to take the crown from the Pope and crown himself. So once again, all these systems of power throughout much of the world are trembling at what's going on with France and this revolution. So now, what is America?